How are we all doing today? Does feel good? You just feel good? Like, I apologize, it's not sunny outside in Sydney. It seems like there's just a little bit of dowering. The sun will be nice. We'll have plenty of it here in the next few months, but today apparently is going to be one of those overcast days, which I don't know. I want to say that kind of impedes the enthusiasm of my students, but I think it's just more of the time of the semester that impedes the enthusiasm of students. You guys are probably pretty overwhelmed right now with all the projects going on. Okay. Well, I will do my best to underwhelm you. All right, underwhelm you. Well, not in the manner that you're thinking, but underwhelming Dr. Barnes. That's basically. All right, so where are we at in Bad Blood? We just got introduced to John Carreyrou. Has anybody actually ever seen any on TV or any engagements with John Carreyrou, the actual individual, not the way he was portrayed in the Hulu Dropout, but the actual individual, John Carreyrou. John Carreyrou, with speaking of underwhelming, he's a very underwhelming individual to speak to. He is the most monotone person I think I've ever heard in a talk. So Reuben Brown actually had had a visit to talk about the results of the Theranos debacle, because everybody kind of knew the whole situation, having read Bad Blood or followed it in the media. So they actually had him come in and said, what was the follow-up? And it was the longest hour and a half that I can remember in a very long time. I really wanted to be interested and engaged because this is one of my favorite books to talk about, one of my favorite stories. But John Carreyrou himself, he's just kind of a very, very dry individual. And it's a good thing his writing is a lot more engaging than his actual speaking, because he was like an audit professor, but worse. Okay, so that's kind of where you can be at right there. And John Carreyrou comes in and he's like looking for a story, and Adam Clapper reaches out and says, "Hey, I got a story for you." And he reaches out to the Fuses, reaches out to Ian Gibbons' widow, and then finally gets a hold of Alan Beam. And Alan Beam says, "Hey, there's all these problems going on," and he was under deep cover, so his name was changed and was not being disclosed as a source, but being protected by anonymity. And for a while, everything was going well. And then Alan Beam got cold feet, says, "You know what? You can use everything I've got to this point, but I don't want to contribute anymore. I'm getting stressed out. It's really affecting my job and ability to work." And I got to imagine that if you've got a multi-billion-dollar company that's threatening to sue, they're threatening legal action against you at every single turn, and they're being backed up by the most powerful attorney on the planet, that's probably got to be pretty stressful for you. It's probably one of those things where you don't sleep very well at night, just wondering how much more your life can get wrecked in that situation. So even though we as kind of impartial witnesses kind of like, come on, guy, don't be a coward. Just like, yeah, I don't know that I would have had the courage to go through with all that either. But anyway, John Carreyrou is like, well, I work for the Wall Street Journal. I'm protected from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So he ends up going in and doing some digging and find some sources who basically say, yeah, Theranos sucks. Theranos is not a good company. And so ends up doing a little bit more digging, finds out about George Shultz's grandson, and talks to him and says, "Hey, what can you tell me?" He says, "Well, here's all the details, and let me give you some email information and some communication that I had that I held on to." And John Carreyrou was like, "Great." And then all of a sudden, there's the ambush. That's actually what it's called. It's chapter 20 is called The Ambush, where they find out that Tyler Schultz has been communicating with the Wall Street Journal based on a blurb from one of the emails. And so, yeah, he ends up going over to his grandfather's house and said, "Okay, you know what? I'm going to re-sign my disclosure agreement, one-page form." Two attorneys come down and says, "Yeah, we're going to sue you unless you sign a big document of confidentiality and tell us everything that you told to the reporter." It's like, no, that's not going to happen. I think I'm being ganged up on here. And so he comes back in the morning and says, "All right, I'm ready to sign the one-page affidavit." The lawyer comes back and says, "Yeah, you're signing all these forms again, and you're going to admit that you're never going to do it." And it was just really, really ugly. And so Tyler Schultz got beat up on, and his parents are basically saying, "Look, if you don't relent, then we're going to have to sell our house to pay for the legal fees." And so that's kind of a scary proposition. How much the legal fees do you think that'd be? That's like a house in San Francisco, which is like $1 million. So that's pretty significant. And so, yeah. And we were actually talking about this yesterday. One of the people in the class who will remain on deep background. Okay. But we were talking about the difference between the way that George Shultz was portrayed in the TV show versus the way that he's portrayed in the book. And he's kind of sympathetic in the book, but in the TV show, he's just kind of like he's the enemy. It's like, Tyler, I don't believe you. You're a bad child. And so, there was very little help and very little dissuasion from or persuasion from George. George is basically like saying, I'm going to do what's best with Theranos because I'm on the board of directors. So yeah, that's where we're at. And finally, John Carreyrou says, okay, here's the deal. I've been trying to get information from Theranos for the longest time. I've actually offered to interview Elizabeth Holmes, and what was the statements like Elizabeth was willing to talk to every reporter on the planet except for John Carreyrou. So they said, look, you're going to have to sit down and talk with us. Otherwise, we're going with what we have. So they're getting ready to go to the Wall Street Journal building and have the confrontation with Boyce Schiller lawyers. That's chapter 21. Okay. And that is kind of like, I guess from our perspective, like we're looking forward to this the confrontation. This is where the blows are going to be thrown. Anybody who's not an accountant or not a lawyer or law or any kind of intellectual discipline is going to be like, wow, this is just going to be the most boring chapter ever because they're just going to talk legal speak. But yeah, it's going to be kind of like the accounting / law equivalent of no holds barred wrestling type thing. So this is our WrestleMania. This is our WrestleMania, folks. All right. So get ready. I want to see enthusiasm. I want to see costumes. I want to see who you're rooting for next week. If you want to if you want to support Boyce Schiller, then you should have a T-shirt that says Boyce Schiller. Okay, I'm obviously being facetious, but there's the enthusiasm. The enthusiasm should be through the roof next week as we see the fallout from this whole thing. All right. Well, that was the fun part, guys, and the enthusiasm levels were really low. We're doing CPA prep now, okay? I was giving you the exciting part before we got to the boring part. So just a note for the next few CPA preps. We got 2 more CPA preps. The multiple choice questions are going to be extremely challenging. First of all, because they're difficult. Secondly, because we're going to be wading into areas of stuff that we have not talked about in depth. You may have to do some work and some research on your own to answer the questions, which that's intentional. That being said, do not get frustrated if you're struggling with the content. It's by design that you're struggling with it. That's actually to identify areas that you need to have some reinforcement. I will say right now, when I start picking out these questions, when I pick out questions, I basically pick out questions and I say, all right, how well am I performing the questions? My hope is that when I pick out 8 questions, that I at least answer 6 out of 8 questions correctly. The very first time that I picked out questions in the section, it was below that. So even I felt like these were a little bit overwhelming questions, but I do think they're worth talking about. That being said, I did give you a very simple TBS. Now, you're probably saying that must have been Dr. Barnes being nice to us because he gave us such hard MCQs. The actual truth is that I was going to give you a different task-based simulation, but the resources that you needed to solve the task-based simulation are not available anymore. They're not available online. So I had to change task-based simulation. So you thought I was being a nice guy. Full disclosure, I wasn't being a nice guy. I was just, I've just had to change things at the last minute. So I was being a nice guy by proxy, I guess is the word, or by circumstance. Okay. Identify the types of testing methods that are appropriate when testing the design effectiveness of controls in an integrated audit. Wow. Have we talked about this before? Yes, we definitely have talked about this before. This is actually a project that we did earlier in the semester. Everybody remember zoo fencing? Not ZOO fencing, ZOU fencing, because Mizzou, yeah, zoo fencing. And we talked about controls, and we talked about the tests that are used both in design and in testing operating effectiveness. This is a really important question to note because it specifies that we're going to be looking at testing the design of controls only. So let's go through the possibilities. Can we use inquiry to test design? I hope the answer is yes, because yes is the only possible answer for inquiry right here, okay? If you said no, you were going to be in a really, really sorry state, okay? What about observation? Can we use observation? Answer is yes. Inspection, I don't know why they included these 3 when these are all 3 yes, okay? There's the only difference is going to be the last 2 right here. So inquiry, observation, inspection, or records of documents, these are all tests that we can do both as design and operating effectiveness of controls, testing and design and operating effectiveness. What about recalculation? Is that a traditional test of controls? So recalculation is almost exclusively a substantive test, okay? A substantive test of details, which makes sense because it sounds like we're doing some sort of quantification or testing balances. And remember, for the assertions related to our management assertions related to controls, those include assertions that relate to transaction events. So yeah, recalculation, not a test of control. So we're down to C or D. What about reperformance? Now I'm going to ask you 2 separate questions here. All right. First question: can we use reperformance to test controls in general? Yes, it's almost exclusively used as a test of controls. Can we use it to test the design of internal controls? If you remember what we talked about back in zoo fencing, the answer was no, okay? Reperformance was only testing the operating effectiveness of controls. This was a really hard question, but a question that you have the ammunition to be able to answer. I don't know if ammunition's the right noun right there, but you had the knowledge, okay? Knowledge is ammunition, folks. You had the knowledge to be able to answer. So the answer is C, yes, 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 no, no. All right, management of AVA Industries, an issuer defined under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, as defined under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, believed it is eliminated a material weakness previously noted in the assessment of internal control. It's hired Hannah Company and CPAs to attest the improvements in internal control. Which of the following is true to this engagement? Okay, so there's a couple of ways to approach this question. I'm not going to say that the second way is the way that you should approach questions in any capacity if you have knowledge. But if you were just completely totally stuck on this one, I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint on some ways you can approach questions when all else fails. So let's answer the question as if we have all the knowledge we need, all right? What is going on in this particular scenario? This sounds like a subsequent remediation of material weakness. And when I say interim, when I say subsequent, I'm talking about an interim remediation. So this is after the financial statement report has already been issued, the report on internal controls. So we already know there's a material weakness. AVA Industries comes in and says they fixed the problem. They now like the auditor to come in and check and make sure that this weakness has been remediated. Is this a legitimate thing, by the way? Can we actually do a subsequent remediation of material weakness? Absolutely, that is certainly a possibility, okay? So, is it required that we do this? No, it's not required, okay? It's not required. So, by the way, that's kind of the key, is that 3 of these answers say it's required. So A and B we can eliminate because it basically says it's required no matter what. It's not, okay? It's only required if AVA Industries elects to have an audit in accordance with PCAOB standards. Again, even if they elect to have an audit under PCAOB standards, you can leave a material weakness unremediated. And we'll develop an adverse opinion on internal controls, but you're not required to remediate that. So B is not our answer. So C is the only one that's left. Let's read what C says. AVA's management must provide a written report to accompany independent company's reports. Now, if we think about the nature of internal controls reporting under PCAOB standards, both the auditor and the management of the organization have to provide a written assessment of the performance of internal controls. Is this statement consistent with that philosophy? What I'm saying is that under PCAOB standards, for internal controls, management has to take responsibility for the design, implementation, and maintenance. And they have to state this outright. They have to issue a report saying this, okay? We as auditors are going to test that, and we're going to present an opinion on that. So there's 2 separate reports on internal controls over financial reporting. There's the management report saying, yeah, we're responsible for this. We assessed it. The controls are operating effectively. And the auditor's report says, okay, management assessed this. We believe that management is correct or management is not correct, that there are material weaknesses, there are not material weaknesses, so on and so forth. So 2 separate reports. Is that consistent with what's in C? Yes, okay. C is likely our answer there just because of that logic. Now, again, this is a lot to take in. This is pretty overwhelming. This is a lot of stuff that we've talked about at a very, very high level, but not really drilled down into. We have talked about all these concepts, but it's probably not everything that you probably didn't remember every single point. So what was going to be the other approaches you take to this, okay? So has anybody ever heard the phrase, one of these things is not like the other? Okay, you may have noticed that 3 of these answers use the word required, okay? Use the word required, which remember I told you to be very careful about absolutes in answering questions, especially as they relate to auditing standards, okay? If you actually were just struggling on this question and said, I don't know, I need to have a rationale for answering this question, but I'm not just going to circle one at random, pick the one that's the least like the others. Now, will this work in every single scenario? Absolutely not, okay? But in the case that you run into a question where you just have no information whatsoever and need a way to actually approach the question, this is one available opportunity for you to say, one of these things is not like the other. I'm just going to pick the one that's the least like the others because that's the one that's most like an outlier. Will it work every time? No, it works some of the time. All right, now we're to attestation engagements. Which of the following activities would you most likely consider an attestation engagement? Well, to answer this question, you need to know what the attestation engagements are. So everybody went back to 417 materials. They pulled out their 417 materials and said, let's go back to chapter 21 because Dr. Barnes talked about this in chapter 21 and I remember it. And I remember from reviewing those materials exactly what the attestation services are. So pro forma financial statements, prospective financial statements, agreed upon procedures, MD&A, compliance, and SOC reporting. Those are the types of services that we can do. So if you remember that, it was easy, okay? Because only one of those is actually listed up here. Only one of those is actually listed up here. Which one is it? Issuing a report about a firm's compliance with laws and regulations, okay? you remember those services? What if you didn't remember those services? I'm going to tell you right now, if you don't remember the services, you just can't answer the question. So that's one of the first things. Remember when we talked about this in chapter 21, I said there were several tables that I want you to focus on. One was the table about the nature of types of engagements. So there are 3 types of engagements that we can do an attestation service, which we just learned about again. Okay, examination, reviews, agreed upon procedures. So you need to know the differences between those types of engagements. The other thing that's important to note is note the different types of services that can be provided and what types of engagements can be performed on those. There's actually tables on those in chapter 21. They're also in the Becker review materials. So those are the 2 most important things I would say that you would need to know with respect to attestation. Outside of reporting, that's going to be a whole nother nut to crack, but we'll talk about that. All right. A practitioner's report on agreed upon procedures is in the form of procedures and findings that should contain. All right. I hate this question right here, but I wanted to include this question because I think it's a really important concept to note. Because the wording that you were going to be looking for is not necessarily the wording that they're going to give you. All right. So let's talk about reports on agreed upon procedures. We talked about this very briefly on Wednesday. What is the nature of reporting on agreed upon procedures? Does it provide any assurance whatsoever? It does not. It's a summary of findings. Okay. Agreed upon procedures provides a summary of findings. And that's basically it. So we're looking for an answer that represents that. All right. So a statement that engagement was conducted in accordance with auditing standards established by ACCT. Is this an audit? This is not an audit. So A is out. A statement the subject matter is responsibility of the practitioner. Is it the responsibility of the practitioner? No, subject matter in all attestation engagements is going to be the responsibility of management. Okay. Negative assurance is provided on the procedure performed. Did we provide any assurance whatsoever? No, we did not provide any assurance. So A, B, and D are all out. Let's look at C. A disclaimer of opinion on the subject matter. Now, this is a really, really challenging one to answer because we think of disclaimer of opinion as an audit opinion, saying this is an audit when we have a scope limitation or a lack of independence, the type of opinion we issue there. But what does disclaimer of opinion mean at its very core? What does that phrase mean? It says we do not issue an opinion. That's what disclaimer of opinion means. Is that an accurate assessment of what happened in agreed upon procedures? Yes. Okay. It's very, very fooling. Okay. You're just kind of like saying, Dr. Barnes, that language, that's meant to fool. And I say, yeah, this is kind of a trick question, which is why I don't like it. But sometimes you're going to encounter this. You need to take a step back and say, what is the question really asking? It's saying, agreed upon procedures, what type of opinion is issued? None. C is the only one that actually gives a context for no opinion being rendered. So C is the answer. If you don't like it, take it up with management. That's all I'm going to tell you. All right. I guess technically I'm one of the managers. So, yeah. I'd like to speak to the manager. Is everybody raising their hand right now, going full Karen on me? Okay. All right. Hopefully not. All right. Robin's company uses the outside service application called Payroll Plus to process payroll. Matthew CPA is the auditor of Payroll Plus, and Stephen CPA is Robin's auditor. Stephen's assessment of risk of material misstatement may be based on the effective operation of controls surrounding payroll, if what? Now, before you answer this question, you need to think about what is being asked in the text of the question, the context of the question. So the last statement says the assessment of risk of material misstatement. So basically what they're going to assess control risk plus inherent risk at may be based on the effective operation of controls. Now, in order for controls to be presumed to be operating effectively, we have to assess both the design of controls and the operating effectiveness of controls. Okay. Now that's a little bit challenging if you think about the question, because we think about, well, it only says operation. Can we ignore design if we're talking about operation? Not really. We've never talked about a scenario where we think just about operating effectiveness controls. So we need to think about both design and operating effectiveness. From that perspective, if we're talking about a SOC report as it relates to audit, we're only going to be talking about a SOC 1 report. The SOC 1 reports are the only ones that are relevant to auditing. Okay. Which type of report are we going to be referring to? Are we going to be referring to a type 1 or a type 2 report? Type 2. Okay. Type 2, remember, type 1 basically says that it's going to be for a point in time talking about the design of internal controls. We're talking about type 2, it's going to be over a period of time, usually a 6-month period. It's going to be reflect both the design and operating effectiveness. So that's basically what we're looking for our answer. We'll look at A, it says provides a report on controls placed in operations. Okay, that's basically saying design. That's a SOC 1 type 1. Part B says report on controls placed in operation and test of operating effectiveness. So that's type design and operating effectiveness. That's SOC 1 type 2. B is our answer. Okay. Question number 6, an auditor provides positive assurance in all of the following situations and reports except. Let's just go through the list. A report on other comprehensive base of accounting and financial statements. Okay, so could we actually issue an audit on something other than GAAP? Is that a possibility? Certainly. Okay, that's certainly a possibility. Say a certain possibility. A report on specified account of financial statements. Can we do piecemeal audits of a financial statement? Like, could I just say, I'm just going to audit revenues? Yeah, okay. If we're engaged by the client, sure. A report on compliance with contractual and regulatory requirements related to audit financial statements. All right, so 2 questions here. Can we do an audit of compliance? Is that a possibility? That is a possibility. That is something we can do. Okay. Do we issue positive assurance in our audit, in such an audit? The answer is no. This is one of those rare exceptions where we don't issue positive assurance in audits. We issue negative assurance. Okay. A compliance audit is always going to be negative assurance. We do not find any need for material modifications or something along those lines. A report on financial presentation to comply with contractual agreements or regulatory requirements. That could be an audit, again, for other reasons other than assurance. So yeah, we're going to be leave it at C because C is the only one that makes sense here. Question number 7, reporting on internal control to meet the requirements of governmental auditing standards. All right, governmental auditing standards, which we've not really talked about at all. So you had to do a little bit of research on this one. Is reporting other than generally accepted auditing standards, and the government auditing standards requires a what? All right. So let's just go ahead and talk through these. Okay. Make sure we understand some detailed differences. Okay. So generally accepted auditing standards differs report except that governmental standards requires what? So a written report describing the entity's internal controls specifically designed to prevent fraud, abuse, and illegal acts. Is that required under governmental auditing standards, do you think? It is, okay. So A is required. It is required. A report describing the scope of the auditor's testing of compliance and internal control. Is that going to be required under governmental auditing standards? See, one person's shaking their head ever so slightly. This is the interesting point about governmental auditing standards. And I will say this comes up a lot with questions that are respecting to governmental auditing standards. They actually call them generally accepted governmental auditing standards, which the old instructor for Becker, he used to call it gagas. That's how he did it. I just call it gagas because, you know, Lady Gaga's cool. You know. Anyway, governmental auditing standards. Under governmental auditing standards, we are supposed to issue a report on internal control. We do not actually test controls. Okay, we don't actually test controls. So B is our answer, by the way. Let's go through the rest. Statement of negative assurance, internal controls not tested to have a material effect on the financial statements. Okay, again. So far requires, so it does require a statement of negative assurance, but it's not talking about specific testing. Statement of positive assurance and internal controls are designed to track material statements and overall testing. So we do actually, I'm missing something here. Okay, it requires a, okay, sorry. I'm completely totally off the scope. I'm going to have to come back to this one because I totally butchered the description of that one. So hold on, I'm going to come back to that one on Monday because I totally messed up the discussion on that one. I realize that now, and I'm not well equipped to answer it. So hold off on that one. I will give you a better explanation of why that's the answer on Monday. All right, apologies. You think that I've been doing this so long that I know everything about auditing, but I messed that one up. Springtown is evaluating it will need to audit in a single audit act. The town will need to engage an auditor to fulfill the expanded requirements of single audit. If the town, so this is actually talking about the threshold and what the requirements of the threshold is. So the threshold is pretty basic at $750,000. Okay. Now the question is it receives $750,000 or it uses $750,000? And sadly, there's no other way to answer this other than just knowing what the answer is. The answer is it has to be whether it expends that amount. Okay. So if you remembered $750,000, then you're probably like, okay, I've got a 50-50 chance. But if you remember, it has to be using that amount, which this actually came up quite a bit during the pandemic era when a lot of organizations were receiving federal funding because they needed to stay afloat. There was a lot of single audit active information that was being bandied about, and that was kind of something that came up. So expending $750,000 for federal financial assistance. I do know that there was some discussion about expanding the thresholds to $1 million in the very near future. I don't think that's happened yet, but keep your eye out on it because that threshold could change in the near future. All right, let's go to the task-based simulation. Like I said, not a task-based simulation. So below transactions, control transactions relate to the integrated auditor and the issuer. Determine if each is an entity level control. If the control is not an entity level control, determine the cycle the control most relates to. So this is a shining moment, guys, because you just have to say, Is it an entity level control? The answer is no. What business process area does it relate to? All right, so let's get into it, or at least let's get into it once I have my notes in front of me. Okay. Management's philosophy and operating style promote effective internal control over financial reporting. So what does it sound like to you guys? What does this statement sound like? It sounds very close to one of the components of internal control that we've talked about many, many times over the course of our time together. What do we call that? Control environment. And we actually talked about this with respect to internal controls over financial reporting. Is a control environment, could that be construed as an entity level control? Absolutely. It's one of the things that we think about as an entity level control. So that's actually going to be our answer. This is an entity level control, guys. Time cards are approved by an employee's immediate supervisor. Is this an entity level control? So an entity level control means that it has to affect all aspects of the entity. Do we think that every point in the entity has time cards that are approved by a supervisor? Like the CEOs of the time card says, man, get my time card approved. I'm gonna go to the audit committee again. Yeah, it's like, yeah. I'm gonna assume salaried employees do not have time cards. Okay, probably do not have time cards. They probably have to note their activity, but to some degree. Actually, that's one of the best things about leaving public accounting is I no longer have to fill out my time and expense reports. They just basically assume that I'm up to good stuff, and which is not always true. But anyway, time cards are employed by a supervisor. That's not it. So what process area are we going to be talking about here? Payroll and personnel. Yep. All computers have identification plates that are listed in a control account. Well, this sure sounds like it could be up by any level control because the entire entity uses computers, but that's not it. Okay, that's not the business operations, the nature of the operations organization or effects or impacts. So we're talking about equipment here. We're talking about items that are related to the business operations. So we're probably talking about what process area? Yeah, property, plant, equipment. I gave it away when I said PP&E, didn't I? All right. I think everybody had that already, but if you didn't, spoiler alert. The purchasing department obtains competitive bids from various suppliers to make sure the best price is obtained for supplies. All right. So yeah, is it control? What do you think? No, this is definitely related to one process area, a very distinct process area. Which one is it? Yeah, so we call it the purchasing cycle. Becker calls it the expenditure cycle. They mean the same thing. By the way, if you do see cycles with different names, the things that we study, just make sure that you remember they are the same thing. They just use different nomenclature. So this is a pretty easy one. The audit committee reviews the annual and quarterly financial statements before filing with the SEC. Is this an entity level control? Yes, if we think about it, what is the whole purpose of the financial statements? The whole point is that we want to make sure that the stakeholders of the organization have an insight as to what the organization's activities are for a given year. Financial reporting in and of itself control at the level of the entire entity. That's one of the very first things you talked about back in the days. Everybody remember those glorious days back in 220 and 221? Everybody's so bright-eyed and innocent. So a few of you had in class, I remember seeing your bright eyes and innocent faces, okay? And now we're jaded and we're old and we're just kind of like saying, this is a control, okay? Back then we thought, this is the purpose. This is what I live for. And now you're just like, this is an entity level control of ours. Yeah, sorry to spoil that for you, okay? But yeah, entity level control. The shipping department utilizes serially numbered bill of lading or bills of lading. Is this an entity level control? No, this relates to very specifically to another process area. Which one is it? Revenue. Shipping stuff out, that's because we're going to generate revenues from that stuff that's shipped out. Management signs off that they have read and understood the company's code of ethics. What do you guys think? Code of ethics. That's something that affects the entity as a whole. Yeah, we would assume that everybody in the organization is subject to the code of ethics, so we could probably evaluate that and say that is going to be an entity level control. All right, final one for today. Shipping documents and sales orders matched before preparing a customer's invoice. That sounds like a great control. That's a matching step, okay? Everybody been keeping up with your matching process, the 3-way, 4-way match, okay? So that'll be relevant. Is this a entity level control though? No, it's not. Okay, what control is this process area over? Yeah, this is a revenue control. All right. So how do we do on the TBS? Does everybody feel a little bit better after TBS? That should have made you getting this like, I remember stuff. I feel good, okay? Then you look back at these and say, well, Dr. Barnes couldn't even answer one of the questions. What hope do I have? I promise I'll get you the answer to the question. I'm just a little bit befuddled today, but we'll get back to it on Monday. Have a good weekend. I'll see you then.